to Mindshock. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. Got a fun one for you today. Is professional wrestling fake? And the common question, wrestling is fake, right? For people who watch or watched pro wrestling in the past, who enjoy pro wrestling or enjoyed it in the past. Obviously, the current product is, well, the less said about it, the better, I guess. But I just wanted to do a super quick video on a lot of these goofs that chastise those that like pro wrestling. Now, obviously, the heyday of pro wrestling was the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. It kind of fizzled out, even though it's probably still highly entertaining in the very early 2000s. Maybe we'll do a podcast on what was the death knell of professional wrestling. Was it the transition into the ruthless aggression era? That was still half decent. Obviously, going into the modern PG era, that I guess you could say that was the death knell, but perhaps the signs were there earlier. That's not what this podcast is about. So, in a lot of discussions, debates, whatever, where pro wrestling is brought up, certain people, there's two groups of people, really. There's probably more. I'm only going to address the two. Let's not fall for false dichotomies, trichotomies, quadratities, or whatever. So, there are people who like Hollywood action movies, and they hate pro wrestling. Pro wrestling's fake, right? As if the Hollywood action movie is actually more scripted than pro wrestling. In pro wrestling, they don't necessarily plan every single little move. There is a little bit of improv where they kind of generally know the gist here and there, and then they're also possibly either, slapping each other on the back or the shoulder. They have certain signs, they have certain taps, and even words or grunts that they coordinate to let their partner, opponent, whatever you want to call them, know what they're doing. So there's a certain amount of improv. Usually the outcome is known. Obviously, there are certain situations like the Montreal screw job with Bret Hart. I probably have to do a dedicated podcast on that because that was kind of big news for a long time. And sometimes one of the parties does not know the outcome. Although there are people that believe that the Montreal screw job was a work through and through on all sides, and that Bret Hart knew exactly what was going on, and he destroyed all those monitors as all part of the act. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe it wasn't. We might have to do a dedicated podcast on that. So there's two groups of people. There are people that I'm going to address, that chastise pro wrestling. They watch Hollywood movies as if they don't know that the good guy most likely is going to win. You go to an action movie with The Rock or Tom Cruise or whoever back in the day, Stallone or Schwarzenegger or Jean-Claude Van Damme even, or Steven Seagal. There's always, I don't want to do any spoilers. There are some movies here and there, a small percent, we're talking less than 1% of movies where they pull something like they might kill one of the main guys. But in general, when you're going to see an action movie with an action hero, there's a certain expectation that the hero is going to face some adversity and that he's going to clean up the bad guys and he's going to win. And you're watching it to be entertained. Now, you could even argue the Hollywood movie is much faker than pro wrestling because pro wrestling is more akin to like a theater production where there's a certain amount of skill required to be able to perform without cuts. Because in an action sequence in Hollywood, a lot of times they're, especially nowadays, obviously back in the day it was more impressive. Nowadays they're on a green screen sound stage. They're yelling cut every second. Half of it is CG anyway, or some kind of special effects. With pro wrestling, you're seeing athletes actually doing the flips. And they're doing it actually in the ring or even outside of the ring, sometimes on the steel ramp or whatever. Sometimes they even had matches going out into the street. And in Hollywood movies, there's mats everywhere out of frame, so you can't see them. So physically, pro wrestling is most of the time a lot more impressive than any Hollywood movies from a physical performance side. Now, from the acting side, you could say pro wrestlers are just not that great at acting. Some of them are, most of them are not, especially nowadays. They're really terrible. Then again, there's plenty of people that like B movies where the acting is so horrible it enters the so bad it's good category. And perhaps I'll do a podcast dedicated to the best so bad it's good movies, where the movies are so horrible, and that's what's driving the entertainment value. Oh no, you could kind of argue like almost every movie coming out now belongs in that category, but except they're so bad they're still bad. They're not actually entertaining. They're just so bad that they're bad. But yeah, so that's one group. So they're really hypocritical in terms of if they like action movies that they know are fake or TV shows, they watch them anyway to be entertained. But because there's a lot of things to criticize about pro wrestling, but the fact that it's so-called fake or scripted, it's not even really that fake. You know, a lot of the impacts are real. A lot of the athletic moves are all real. They're obviously not punching or kicking each other in the face as hard as they can most of the time. Although with some of those steel chair shots, I mean, they're going pretty hard. And they're, you know, especially if the pro wrestlers had a problem with each other, they weren't even necessarily waiting for the wrestler to put his arm up to block the chair shot. I mean, you could look up compilation videos of unblocked chair shots, full contact drop kick to the face, either by accident or intentional because pro wrestlers didn't like each other. So they're more real than any of the Hollywood movies. So there goes that argument. Now here's the second point. There are probably some kind of boomer goofs or people who don't watch action movies at all and never did. And they're chastising pro wrestling because it's fake. Now you would think that might be slightly less hypocritical. But here's the thing. Most of those types of goofs, they watch the mainstream news thinking it's real. They're that gullible marks. So they're chastising so-called pro wrestling marks. Now, there is a fair argument to be made because I don't know what the current number in 2023 is. There are people who still think pro wrestling is real. Now, whether you want to say they have mental impairments, but back in the day before Curtain Call, and perhaps I'll have to do a dedicated podcast on that as well, I wouldn't call myself a hardcore pro wrestling fan, but I did enjoy the odd pro wrestling event back in the 90s, maybe the first years of the 2000s. So what does everybody think about the clown show that is the political theater? I know there's a lot of pro-Trump people on the channel. And again, if you haven't checked out the previous podcast on Trump that I've touched upon the man, the myth, the legend that is the Donald. And yeah, I mean, you got to give him credit. Even like I'm not a statist, and obviously I don't encourage voting for slave masters of any kind. But you got to give Trump credit. I mean, he did do a lot for exposing corruption. I mean, he's probably done. I mean, it's kind of hard to really metric it, but other than Alex Jones, I mean, who else has really exposed corruption to the level that Trump has? Now, you can say he didn't follow through on his promises and that he still did some damage to 2A and, of course, all that and COVID insanity. But in terms of bringing awareness to corruptions and corrupt profiteers within the political theater, I mean, who's done more than he has in terms of awareness? You got Alex Jones, and then who might be a shill as well, just like the Donald. But I'm not claiming one way or another. This is Mindshock. But obviously, Bill Cooper is probably the most well-respected, and for good reason. But, I mean, he just didn't have the reach. I mean, part of that is Bill Cooper was before social media, and largely even before the internet era. I mean, obviously, the internet was around, but, you know, this guy's killed off November 01. Not long after September 11th, which if you haven't seen his prediction, quite curious. But in terms of reaching the masses, I mean, he had a relatively popular radio show. I mean, he was kind of Alex Jones before Alex Jones. And then for those that don't know, I mean, some believe that Bill Cooper completely exposed Alex Jones for being a shill. But who knows? Either way, Bill Cooper wasn't really around in a time period he had the kind of reach that someone post 2010 would have, just based on widespread use of the internet and the rise of social media. And with all the censoring and Trump getting kicked off internet platforms, I mean, we have the Streisand effect in full in full swing. I mean, even like after getting banned, I mean, you could argue Trump has more influence now than ever before, just like Alex Jones. And the goofs that actually believe in censoring, I mean, obviously the mental capacity is just not there to comprehend that censoring and deplatforming people only gets others even more curious that might otherwise not have been. And then obviously in the age of fact checkers who get everything wrong, I mean, they are useful though. Whenever you see a fact check claiming something is false, then obviously the opposite is usually true, just based on historical metrics. Again, without getting into any specifics of anything. But but yeah, I mean, love him or hate him, the Donald has done a lot to expose the corruption within the political theater. But it's I mean, just the entire way. I'm probably going to have to do a dedicated podcast on so-called pretend society, because there was this quote going around about how we live in a pretend society. Everything's pretend. And, it's weird. On the surface, it kind of, maybe some people might say, oh, well, that's just, they might appeal to incredulity. And they might say, oh, well, that's just nonsensical. But when you really stop and think about it objectively, logically, and neutrally, like we do on Mindshock, it kind of makes sense. I mean, what is really holding everything together other than common hallucinations in either the validity of certain authorities or the way things need to be, or even what is true or not true regarding certain theories, commonly accepted or not? Again, I always talk about how in the past, just learning from history, whatever the majority of things that the majority of people believed in were false. And there's a certain amount of collective narcissism where a lot of these authority worshipping cultist goofs, they hallucinate that we're just living in these magical times. Where, yeah, in the past, the majority of people were wrong about the majority of things, but now, magically, it can't be. It just can't be. Whatever is so-called commonly accepted or commonly indoctrinated, it has to be true. It just has to, because they're too mentally weak to consider any other option. It's too scary for them. It's their safety blanket. The cult of authority worship is their safety blanket. This is the mentality of coincidence theorists, the corruption deniers. So I just find it really amusing, particularly in the realm of people discussing how fake professional wrestling is, while they worship the idiot box and they're permanently plugged in to the political theater that's much faker than any pro wrestling event. I just find that amusing. Call me crazy. But that's it for now from myself, Bruce McGuire, your not so humble host. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the Mindshock podcast. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, like and share, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comments section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.